we are so grateful to have you here. I'm just going to read a little bit of her biography because there's really even not enough time to get through all of it because she is that accomplished. And she has made such an impact, as I said, on every field that we could possibly even think of. And we are just so delighted to have her here today. T. Denean Sharpley-Whiting is the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Distinguished Professor of African American and Diaspora Studies and French at Vanderbilt University, where she directs the Cali Research Center for the Study of Global Cultures and Politics. And she is now the Vice Provost of Library Studies. Arts and Library Studies, also at Vanderbilt University. She is the author or editor of 15 books, 3 novels, and the latest of which includes the Dalmatin French edition, La Vénus au Ténor écrit, 1810 1814, suivi des textes inédits, the co-edited Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, and Sexualité, Identité et Corps Colonisés, and Bricktops Paris, African American Women, Expatriates, and Jazz Age Paris, which was absolutely amazing. And the autobiography of Ada Bricktop Smith, or Miss Baker's Regrets, a 2015 American Library in Paris Book Award Long List nominee and Choice Outstanding title of 2015. And she is currently working on the book that she'll be presenting from today, a monograph entitled Men I'd Like to Have Known, and what's the other part of it?
And one woman I'd like to have met.
Exactly, and we will be hearing today about the one woman that she would like to have met, Belle da Costa Greene. So without further ado, I'm going to sit down and we are going to listen and learn from the master, Dr. Tracy Sharpley-Whiting. Thank you.
Yeah, it is lovely to be back, and I just remembered, I was like, didn't I just present on something there of this book? And so I was like, okay, so you all are involved in my processes of writing and evolution, because I had at that point said, I'm always writing about women, so I wanted to write about men that I would have liked to have known. And then there comes Belle da Costa Greene on my radar. And so I was like, well, it would have been lovely to have met Belle, although Belle probably would have avoided me primarily because she was passing. But it would have been lovely to have met her in some, maybe in Paris or something in her time. So the work, of course, is, as Lamant's explained, and I've kind of discussed this, evolving out of this work on these interesting figures at various moments in time that somehow intersect in some ways with France, and in ways in which France represents a kind of ideal in certain ways, a utopia, a way to escape, or certainly a space in which they've been allowed to create. And so the other individuals are all, of course, creatives in certain ways. They're in film. I have, of course, one white man, and she's my only woman. The other 3 are Alexandre Dumas, and of course, when I was here, I presented on the kind of intersection between my great-great-grandfather, 3 times great-grandfather, who served in the Civil War and was a runaway slave, but then discovered, of course, we were related to, I thought we were simply owned by Daniel Boone, but we were actually related to Daniel Boone. And so that was part of that narrative as well, and Wilfredo Lam, the Afro-Cuban artist as well, and his turn in Paris in terms of discovering his identity, which led to his painting very differently, and then landing in Martinique, where Aimé Césaire further impacted what he began to paint. But with Belle, I think it's, I was taken with Belle, and I kind of happened upon Belle in my reading. I think it wasn't even Heidi's book, which I think is a very important book, but that wasn't the book that introduced me to Belle. I think I must have come across her I was reading about libraries. My new position, of course, started in June, at the end of June this year. And libraries, of course, are what we do, right? We could not do what we do without libraries. And so I was like, well, this is a perfect position. And art, of course, is something that I write about. And it was the perfect kind of blending of these 2 areas that were critical to shaping my scholarly trajectory. So as I began to read more about just libraries and what librarians do, because the problem is that people don't really understand what librarians do, because it's what they do appears so invisible, which is a wonderful thing, but it's also an awful thing because people don't appreciate what, how it's so seamlessly you can get that book. Right? There's an entire process, right, that happens. There's an entire process that happens when we think about archives that we desperately need in our work, and how archivists and libraries and curators are extremely important to that process, which makes it so seamless and invisible. And so I have close to 200 people that report to me. About 155 of those are in the libraries. And so part of it was getting to know each and every one of them, talking to them. Vanderbilt University Press is also under me, as well as the Fine Arts Gallery, and all sorts of other things that we're kind of hatching at Vanderbilt. But it was really about getting to know the libraries, because I kind of felt like the libraries kind of get the short shrift, particularly at our institution, Central Library, which everybody kind of, at least the humanists and the social scientists, use. The other libraries seem to be functioning quite well. So it was really, really important to get to know them and what they do. And so this is how I happened upon Belle. Just reading different things about libraries, the evolution of libraries, the architecture that goes into libraries. Why do libraries, have to be, why should they be structured in certain ways? The future of libraries, in the same way that I was reading about the future of museums and what that looks like. And so there was Belle, but certainly not Belle as the Black woman, right? And so as I went down the rabbit hole, as we all do, right? Then it was like, whoa, okay, this is very, very interesting. And so then, of course, that's when you got to the fiction writing and all that stuff there. But what was fascinating to me was Belle's encounter in this world, and how she ended up where she was. And so I first want to talk a little bit about, the world that she entered, right? And how the Morgan and J.P. Morgan himself kind of transformed the culture of art collecting, right? And the ways in which books themselves were considered art, and still are, right? They're an art to put together, and rarer books still are kind of art, and right. And Incunabula, which Belle would become an expert at, was particularly important in this kind of collection process. And so he was an avid collector. Not that he was, necessarily highly intellectual or whatever. There was a part of him that simply was wealthy and wanted to be cultured, and he figured art and libraries and rare books would be the way in which he could kind of have that imprimatur, particularly from old Europe. But it was his acquisitive nature that transformed radically how we think about, art and kind of public institutions, right? So I'm going to read you just a wee bit about Morgan, and so kind of setting the stage. So though we can only speculate about the intimate pleasures that fueled Morgan's insatiable thirst for art objects, we can be more accurate about his impact on the international art world in the turn of the 20th century. In a little more than a decade between 1900 and 1912, Belle went to work for him in 1909. John Pierpont Morgan amassed an unparalleled collection of works of art and books included in that. As an art collector, his historical relevance went far beyond the objects he purchased. A truly international player, Morgan transformed the market for and the reception of European art at the beginning of the 20th century, greatly contributing to the globalization of the art world. Unlike any other American of his generation, Morgan played the collecting game on the global stage in much the same way that he conducted his banking activities. His acquisitive nature established the Metropolitan Museum as one of the world's most important collections of medieval art. Effectively, unlike Isabella Stewart Gardner, who, of course, you'll see the quote by her with respect to Belle, who founded the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, or Henry Clay Frick and the Frick collection, Morgan believed that established public museums were the proper repository for works of art. Under Belle da Costa Greene's leadership, the library became public in 1924. Morgan also thrived on the complexity and dynamism of large institutions. If discovering and interpreting old art was an enterprise, the public museum was its headquarters. And so this is important because unlike others who were building these institutions, right, for their own private, enjoyment and collection, and sort of to leave some sort of stamp, right, whether in New York, as they were, all fighting to be the number one robber baron in the Gilded Age. Morgan was thinking largely about public institutions. Of course, as he was still building his own library and his own museum, which eventually Belle convinced I mean, he was always thinking about going public. He died, and of course, his son would come into to the inheritance. But Belle had to kind of convince him that he needed to take the institution public, right? For her, she wanted scholars to have access to these things, and this is extremely important. Foremost, it's most important to realize that Belle da Costa Greene was, or Belle Greener, Marion Greener, that she, of course, wanted people to recognize her as a librarian, first and foremost, right? She never wanted that overshadowed. So she goes to work for Morgan in 1909. She, from there, kind of, and I guess, do we have yeah, I'm gonna say, can I click through some? Okay, so this is Belle. Let me go to the side here. And this was taken, of course, in 1911, and we know that, documenting, this is a part of Belle loved to take pictures, right? And she loved to kind of, document her in different costumes or in different places. She was always well dressed. But this is also part of that kind of Black elite experience that she grew up in, right? And so what is fascinating about her, so 1879, she's born into the colored elite. Her father is, Richard T. Greener. Interestingly enough, of course, Belle follows in her father's footsteps because he becomes the first librarian in Reconstruction, South Carolina, right, at the University of South Carolina. There's a statue of him now. And it was a very well-respected library. And then he eventually takes a law degree and becomes Dean of Howard Law. So he is very, very well-respected, but so is her mother. She's a music teacher. And so are the grandparents in DC. And so she's born into this colored elite. And so when many are attempting to figure out how did Belle, how did she become Belle da Costa Greene? Well, she was from a very intellectual family, right? She was shaped in the crucible of the colored elite. It was not white society that gave form to Belle. It was actually Black folk, right? Who, despite the various opportunities that were denied, managed to rise to the top. And her father, of course, was deeply, deeply committed to Black folk, right? And this was part of the problem because he was, of course, very light himself, but he ran with Douglass and all of them. And he really wanted to see Black folks succeed. And he was certainly denied opportunity after opportunity, making it very hard for the family. He ends up in New York. He brings the family with him after they leave DC. And things have become, again, increasingly difficult for them. By the time, so he's in and out, a bit of a philanderer. So that caused some issues in the marriage as well. But he was, gone a lot, in and out. But he would come home and increasingly get aggravated because Genevieve, he'd heard, had been passing. Of course, this was impacting his ability to kind of, intersect and run with the big dogs at the time because they were like, why, your wife's passing, and eventually she decides that she's going to, when he leaves, and he wants nothing to do with the family. He's not a very nice person. Some of the letters are not very nice. But when he decides that he's done and he wants nothing to do with them, they all decide to pass. Now, what is very important about this passing is that in 1896, this is about the time when the family decides to pass. When she thinks that this is the best, moment. Why? Because, of course, Plessy v. Ferguson. Right? And so they don't want to get trapped on the other side of the color line. They want to have, Genevieve wants her family to have the same opportunities that other families have had, her children to have those opportunities. And so she wants to take advantage of it. At this time, Belle is about 17 years old. And so, but she'd always shaved, years off her, she looked younger. And so she would always claim to be anywhere from 5 to 15 years younger. But at the time she was 17. And so it's understandable why she would have opted to pass. And with that, though, but it was an open secret kind of with Belle because she was, she looked Black to most white Americans. As one of the quotes, and we can kind of continue on. So, this particular quote, of course, discusses, when she's first ascended into the Morgan, and of course her appearance. As we saw earlier, she dressed very well, right? She did not look like a librarian, and she would say, just because I'm a I'm a librarian doesn't mean I have to dress like one, whatever that meant, right? That librarians were supposed to be self-effacing and whatnot. She was quite flamboyant, right? And of course, she had the Morgan money behind her. So not only would she just come in dressed to the nines, she could buy up so many things. And so that was some of the reading that you had where, she had people quaking in their boots. Like, was she going to purchase them? Was she going to outbid whatever, particularly expensive books might have been available? And so let's go to the next one. So again, this is from the same, this is in the archive, same Princeton when she was taking these pictures. These occurred somewhere around Princeton. So this is in the studio, same pose. We can see the orchid there. And she liked to wear the orchid on her clothing, a lot of the pictures that she had. Let's go to the next one. And so this is when she dies. So she dies in 1950. And this is a very important quote because, as I said, the prescriptive dignity of her office, her single-minded devotion, her canny sense of quality in books or manuscripts set Miss Greene in a unique position in the library world. And so there were others that talked about, if it were not for Belle, the Morgan Library and Museum would not have been what it was, right? And so when they were all celebrating, but this was all before they knew she was Black, right? And so they were celebrating, that she could not have made, that the Morgan would not have been what the Morgan was without Belle da Costa Greene. And if you go through like the New York Times from this time period, when she comes in the public eye, and Belle herself was a very private person. So she did not, because of course she was always, she had to be concerned about being outed, right? And so, but there were always things, Belle da Costa Greene is on a cruise ship going to blah, 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 blah. Belle da Costa Greene was at this particular tea ceremony. Belle da Costa Greene bid, $2,000 or donated $1,000, which at the time was a lot of money, to X, Y, and Z. And so she was in New York Times just followed Belle everywhere. But she was, again, very private and had amassed a good deal of money. When Morgan died, he left her $50,000, which is close to $1 million in today's money. And he also made a point to tell his son that she could not be relieved of her duties as director of the library. At that point, she was the personal librarian still, before the Morgan went public. And so I suspect the reason why he put that provision in there is that he knew, and everyone keeps dancing around it, but I believe that he knew that Belle was Black. And that she was passing. He was not a progressive man by any, idea. Our imaginations can't maybe. No, he was not. I mean, some of the things they wrote were highly anti-Semitic and fairly awful between he and his sons and other correspondences. But there was a streak, I think, in New York in which, there were those who thought, you give certain people an opportunity. And here's one of the letters that I want to read that is important. We can stay here if you want, but it's where they talk about Belle. So what we understand is that if Morgan didn't know, I think it would be impossible for him, but if he never questioned her race, and certainly, so there was nothing in the archive that he left. He left, very seldom left. He didn't leave a lot, right? Not a lot of personal correspondences. So there was nothing in the archive to indicate it. But there are the other correspondences between a philanthropist and Morgan's neighbor, Grace Hoadley Dodge, and Emma Charlotte Revel Moody, who's the wife of Dwight Lyman Moody. He was the founder of the Northville Seminary for Young Ladies in Massachusetts. And this is where Belle went. Belle initially was working at Teachers College. People assume she went to Teachers College. She actually was working in the office of Teachers College. And Grace Dodge was one of the board of trustees. And so she noticed that Belle was a hard worker and whatnot, and got to know the mother, Genevieve, and decided that, she wanted to help. And so I think it was more kind of, let's help this particular, and so this letter will give you some background. So she writes, I write even in the midst of this busy time to tell you of a girl I much want at Northfield. She is Belle Greene, and her mother has made formal applications through Miss Hall. The family has a sad history. The mother was a Mount Holyoke graduate, a teacher. She married a man with Spanish, Cuban, plus Negro blood. It keeps changing. A lawyer who graduated at the top of his class at Harvard. He turned out clever but bad, and after terrible experiences, she left him, plus has been supporting her 5 children with terrible struggle. Belle is bright, quick to learn, easily influenced, full of fun and energy. While the trace of Negro blood is noticeable, Belle has always associated intimately with the best class of white girls. At the college, she was a great favorite with many, being entertained by them, going out with them. The mother, of course, is white with good ancestry, and Belle inherits brains plus ability. Trusting that the work is being abundantly blessed at Dear Northfield, thanking you for all you will do for Belle. So Belle, of course, she would attend Northfield for 3 years, like most women who went there, at Dodge's expense. So it's very clear that Dodge, who lives in proximity, he's a neighbor of Morgan. She clearly has probably told Morgan about Belle. And then he decides when she's at Princeton, they probably had some role in helping, Belle there, to pluck her from Princeton and bring her on as his personal librarian for whatever reason. But it's very clear that Belle's race was being discussed quite openly, and that she was, they knew that she was Black. So what's fascinating though about this is that she's noticeably Negro. So she passed, but she was not white passing, right? And so she, in many respects, spectacularly pushed the boundaries of whiteness to accommodate her, right? So she was, and of course, in many respects, she lived her life on a dare, right? So she dared people to out her publicly, and no one did. And of course, she had the Morgan's, millions behind her, and no one would dare to question Morgan, right? Like, who's going to question, the man who, of course, saved the United States, twice from economic default, right, at this particular moment, right? He steps in with the banks. And so nobody's going to question him. But equally, there's this blend of racism that's operating, right? That there is simply no way then that Belle, as fine breeding as she is and wonderful, et cetera, could have been anything but white, right? That she had to, that this greatness, this ability it could only be embodied by whiteness, right? And so she, of course, was doing a very interesting, skillful double dutch on this color line. And so it didn't hurt that she, the mother, of course, did not go to Mount Holyoke. She had never graduated from Mount Holyoke. So Genevieve had begun weaving this narrative very early on. So this letter was written about 1896. Again, she was laying the groundwork every time the husband would leave for these long periods of time. And so she was just laying the groundwork so eventually she can move on. And because she was fairer than Belle, she would, of course, pass as white. Now, the woman who lived with them, they had a live-in maid, was a Black woman. And so she probably knew a great deal of the family's secrets and never told. But yeah, so she basically, there's an interesting tension here that Belle's also playing with around Americans' understanding of the Iberian Peninsula, right? So she selects Portuguese deliberately, right? Because the Spanish and the southern, the Mediterranean, the Italian, southern Mediterranean, and of course the Spanish and the Portuguese are considered white but off-white. They're white but not quite, right? And so everybody kind of always looks at them, and so particularly then, like, are they really? They're a little more swarthy complexion, right? That's the kind of language around them. And so Belle deliberately is playing on an ignorance about, Spain, Portugal, and the southern Mediterranean when the family decides to take this name, and they all become da Costa Greene. And of course, it worked to great effect. But what is also, she dared to be subjected to the treatment, right, of, various others who attempted to pass, or, Black women at that particular moment. And so, as I like to say, she would not, of course, be pushed or jump from a window, a la Nella Larson's, passing, right, or violently beaten in an alley by a white paramour. When we think about Sarah Jane in Douglas Sirk's 1954 screen adaptation of Fannie Hurst's 1933 novel, Imitation of Life, right? Or live as a working class white woman, as, the first one, which starred Freddie Jackson. So there was not, Belle was going to do this on her own terms. And so, again, this kind of reinvention was very much dependent on a geographical ignorance and muddled ideas about Europe, as well as the money. And intellect, right? So we can go to the next slide. Right, so this is, again, one of the busts that's still in the Morgan of Greene in 1925. And so you can see it, they have it near her desk at the Morgan. If you ever have an opportunity to visit, I just find it to be, it's a very interesting kind of representative of the kind of regal Belle. Next one, we got the next slide. And so, of course, this is Belle writing, to Morgan, and she, it says the collection in the Morgan should become preeminent, especially for incunabula manuscripts, bindings, and the classics. So at this, she's young, in 1909. Well, she's presenting herself as 21. We know that she's not 21, right? But she's presenting herself as 20. She's 30 at this point, but she's telling, Morgan believes she's 21. So he's like, wow, what a smart, brilliant 21-year-old. And so she's writing to him to tell him, this is what I want to do in the collections here. And she sets about doing it. The next slide. So this is, of course, her working at the libraries, and this is at the Biblioteca in Florence, and of course Belle's lover at the time for a great deal of years was Bernard Berenson, and as we discussed earlier, he himself was passing. He was a Lithuanian Jew, and he was passing as white. Goes to England, marries a British woman, and then decides to become completely Anglophile. Ends up in Florence. But it is Belle, actually, who convinces him to donate his papers and the villa itself to Harvard, right? She tells him that he needs to leave something. So Belle is encouraging him. As they get older, they're no longer lovers. But she was 30 years old. They had, met each other, fell passionately in love. And they would write these elaborate letters. And she finally gets to him in Europe. And this is her first time abroad. And she's just overwhelmed by Notre Dame. They do all this shopping. She purchases some more manuscripts. They tour, Italy. But she's a single woman with a married man. And so people are kind of running. They're trying to dodge them, but the rumors start swirling. And eventually it gets back to Morgan. And she's trying to go back to Europe at various times. But Morgan, of course, rages. So he keeps her at the library, almost kind of, kind of like a black beard, right? He keeps her entombed in this, in the library during the work there, because he does not want her, affiliating with Bernard Berenson. Not to mention he was also competing. He would help, other buyers and when they were at these, shows bidding. But, Belle ends up becoming pregnant. Now the family, of course, has made a pact, I suspect, because none of the others, they've all married. There are 5 of them in all. They've all married, and none of them have children except for the youngest, right? And she has 2 children, and the family is furious because they do not want to be discovered. And so luckily there's no throwbacks, with these 2 children. But Belle has to go to England to have an abortion. Right. And she never, of course, she's very naive. She was, over 30 when she gets involved for the first time sexually. And so she was very, very naive and in love and whatnot. And so she was stunned, the outcome of, this is a pregnancy. And she, they didn't think about keeping it. Certainly she was not going to allow that to happen. It would upend everything. She was the primary supporter of her family, her mother and the brothers and sisters, right? And so she carped all the time about how the family was, dependent on her. And so she could not run that risk that this, of having a child, particularly with a married man. Now, of course, she did admire Isadora Duncan, who did all sorts of, had multiple children and multiple baby daddies, right? And she was just like, whoa, what, talk about freedom, and so she was very good friends with her, but she could not, of course, run that risk. But she certainly admired Isadora Duncan on that score. So we can continue to the next slide. So again, she writes to Berenson. And so again, she's very, by this time, swept up. She's visited, Paris. And then she says, if I can make a big institution out of it, it will be all that I or anyone else can expect, to make it a research center for scholars in certain fields, to make our material available to them and to make them welcome here. So this is ultimately Belle's vision, and this is in 1913. Of course, she begins lending stuff very early. So during the war, she's sending things and attempting to help, sharing this kind of library lending as well as art. And Morgan himself, of course, was lending art even before he died. So her idea was to take it public, and eventually that would happen. She convinced the son to do so. Next slide. Now, this is her, of course, in her Egyptian costume. And this is very important because when we think about Black history at this particular moment, a lot of Black folks were, of course, tracing their roots to Egypt. It didn't matter what connections they had or if they didn't have connections. The idea is that we were descended from Egyptians, right? And so this is part of, Belle's kind of cosplay around it. And so she would have been in keeping in line with other Black folks who were, towing that kind of, we are connected to the great people line. Du Bois, of course, was writing about, in his scholarly, very well researched way around Nubia and other places. And so Belle was embracing that. And so she would also take all of these pictures and send them to Bernard Berenson, right? So, he loved to have various pictures of Belle. And so this, of course, lets you know what was happening privately. What was being said about Belle, that she had no idea. People were too scared to say these things to Belle's face. But so he says she has a bulbous nose, perhaps caught from the numerous photographs of her patron, many of which hang and stand and lie about her office. Of course, J.P. Morgan had a huge nose. He had, rosacea on his nose, and it was purple and pockmarked. And he would always make people retouch his photographs whenever he too liked to take pictures, but he did not like his nose. But the idea here is what the symbolism is that, that somehow when we think about Black and Jewish noses, right, this kind of pseudoscience is coming into play. Even though Morgan is not Jewish, the point is that, this is what the author is alluding to when he's writing. He's attempting to bring this into conversation to effectively jettison Belle from her, kind of pedestal stance as a white woman, right? So he's trying to bring her down, right? And so he says, and her skin must have been very swarthy, for she wore white powder, which made her look kind of speckled gray, like a Negro you see pouring dusty cement into the mixers on a building construction jobs. So this particular letter is, again, very telling of the private correspondences and the talk around Belle, even though Belle herself would have, now this same man, as he's writing on about Belle, he's so delighted that she's taken the time to meet with him. He cannot believe that, she's taken the time. And there were several calls from her secretary while they're in this meeting. And Belle is like, okay, no, don't disturb this meeting I'm having with this individual. Now he's, Morrison Parrish is, of course, a collector of Victorian novels. Belle is like, I don't like what you've, encased these novels in. Oh, they're just temporary for transportation. He's delighted to have her approval. He's writing, and she did this and she did that, and she was so wonderful. And so at the same time, he's saying these horrible things about her. He also recognizes her brilliance, and he needs her approval desperately, right? But it gives you some sense of the kind of gossip that people were very much preoccupied with what Belle was, or they knew, but they just wouldn't say, right? Next slide. So this is an interesting portrait. So, Paul Hiller is a French artist. He was known for painting ladies of the Belle Epoque in France. He sails to New York. He gets an assignment to paint, the astrological, right in Grand Central, right? He's the one who designed that, right? So he came over for that, and he began to draw women in the United States. And so he had a collection. He drew about maybe 18 to 20 women, but he took 8 to 10 of them back with him to France because he wanted to demonstrate American beauty, right? These women would be the standards of American beauty. And you should read the write-up in the New York. They published these in the New York Times. And they talk about how he captured the essence of the American beauty, their refinement, their whatever, all the while not knowing that Belle was Black. So this completely undercuts, again, ideas about race and beauty, right? So they're going on and on and on about how Belle, in particular, represents this kind of ideal beauty and refinement. And he's captured the American spirit like no other has and taken it back to France with him. And so this was kind of the ultimate dupe, right? And so, of course, this is Isabel Gardner writing to Bernard Berenson. And as he said, this is early, again, in her career at the Morgan, when she says, it turns out she is a half-breed and I suppose can't help lying, right? So, again, private correspondences. Berenson knows he won't disclose because he's in love with Belle. And she's upset because Belle has said that some of her collections were not any good. She's pronounced some of the things that she's collected were not very good, were perhaps fakes or whatnot. And so she's very, very angry that Belle has written this and it's gotten back to her. And so this is what she writes in turn. Again, never, ever confronting Belle. And so this is a picture that we, would often see of Belle as she's getting older in 1929. Again, dressed, very well. When she died, she was a wealthy woman. She owned the apartments she lived in. She had two that she had put together in a building right off, in Fifth Avenue. And she had stocks and, wonderful art and all sorts of other valuable things that she had collected over the years. But this is kind of representative of, Belle's kind of class and sophistication. And of course, this is her. She's going to, talking about going to a particular party and how, she is, she essentially would look like a huckleberry in a bowl of milk because that was essentially who she was associating with, mostly white folk. So in a sea of whiteness, she was very much concerned with how she was being perceived, right? And she also was a bit obsessed with blondes, right? As a kind of standard of beauty and whiteness. And how she was not that. And so these are the kind of interesting, intimate kind of discussions she's having with Berenson, who she would eventually ask, as she knew she was dying, to burn all of the letters that she had sent him. And he balks, of course, at that. He does not tell her that he balks at it, but he's so troubled that he writes another friend and says, it's like asking me to burn, half of my biography, right? So he doesn't want to, burn those letters. It's like half of him, right? So she burns all of his letters, right? So we don't get to hear what he's saying to her, but we do get to read these correspondences. And were it not for, of course, Jean Strauss's 1999 book on J.P. Morgan. She's the first one who discovers Belle's birth certificate, right? And in that birth certificate, it reveals who the father is and that Belle is Black. Right. And so, interestingly, of course, the Morgan does nothing about this. Right. They say nothing about it. So this is 99. Nothing about it. And they had to be kind of gradually forced to kind of deal with this question that this, institution that is a fabulous institution, an old world institution, right, a Gilded Age institution, was effectively built by a Black woman with the help of Morgan's money. And so they will be doing a big kind of fete, if you will, of Belle and the Morgan in 2024. And so myself and a number of other individuals are on the board, this advisory board that they've created to help them put together these discussions around passing and what that meant for Belle. And why she passed, and why didn't Black people out her? Because Black people knew her father, vice dean of Howard Law. This was at a time when, Alain Locke is around. Locke knew everybody Black, right? He was going to chronicle, like who's who in Blackness. He was as bad as our boy, we used to call him street corner intellectual, J.A. Rogers. J.A. Rogers was claiming people who we knew, everybody. He's the one who we get. Oops, this has come down. He's the one who tells us about Queen Charlotte. Right, back in the day, right? Queen Charlotte was Black, he says, right? And he's like digging around. These people knew who was Black. And there's no way with her father having been the dean of Howard Law School that no one knew. Equally, I think it's interesting, again, Belle herself, in her office, there was a painting. At the time, it was called The Moor, now it's called a man or some sort. It's just now, it's been renamed, and they thought it was from the Tintoretto school, but now they're saying it's actually a Tintoretto. But she hung it right behind her desk. It resembled her father. And you could probably Google it now and just to have a look at it. I should have probably had it in the slides. But it was almost as if Belle was daring somebody to say something, right? So, yeah, okay, say something. Yeah, he's about my color. That's a Moor, right? And so they've, again, changed the name now. I don't know why. But at the time, they were calling it, a Moor. and was dressed in refined, more European clothing, as they would do during that era. But Locke writes her, right, and he says, hey, I'm doing this book on the Negro in art, and I'd like this particular painting to be featured. And she gives him permission to feature the painting. So you can't help but he knew. Locke knew, she knew, and it just, and it was a fascinating essay by Mary Church Terrell. It's called When Black Becomes White. And she writes about her own experiences about people passing and why people were passing and why she understood why they were passing. And she gives several accounts of this, idea of passing out of convenience. I'm sure we've all had family members who've passed. I had family members who passed because it was convenient for no other reason. They would go back to black, but if they wanted to go to some department store, why not? And they thought it was hilarious, right? That they could do so without anybody ever knowing. And then they would take my father along, who was actually a bit browner. My grandmothers, it was my great-grandmother, my grandmother, who were very fair. And they would just say, again, he's Spanish. Nobody said a word. They just assumed he was Spanish because they're swarthy, right? And also, who's going to question these white ladies? Why are they bringing this black child around? So he had to have been Spanish, right? So there were interesting kind of racial protocols that allowed for passing around also femininity and how you treated white women that wouldn't allow you to challenge their veracity, that black women would also take advantage of. And Mary Church Terrell was very clear that these are the things that you forced us to do because your idea of Americanness is not flexible or open enough to include us. So we have to seize our birthright citizenship. We are American. We want to be treated as American. This isn't passing. This is actually just grabbing the rights that we deserve, right? And it's a very fascinating essay. And of course, she herself writes about her experiencing passing, right? She would go on a black car, and then when she would do it, she would, at one point was accosted by a white male passenger who was attempting to assault her sexually. She began to ride in the white cars. And when she was traveling down south to give her lectures for, the Black Women's Club movement, she's like, I'm not staying in these substandard hotels. This is ridiculous. And on her way from one of those travels, when she encountered one of the black folks who were, a part of the organization, and they were like, you're not going to get on the white train, are you? Right? They were challenging her. And she was like, no, of course I won't. A little upset that she had to, right? Because she got in the line. She was watching the white passengers just get their tickets stamped and get right on the train. The black, where the blacks had to go and get on. It was crowded. They stood for hours trying to get her. And she was like, no rational person should have to deal with this sort of inconvenience. And so she completely understood this whole question of passing. And I think we're at an era when Heidi wrote her book on Belle. She attempts to parse this idea around passing because she doesn't want people to shame Belle or whatever. She's trying to bring Belle, to a wider audience. The book wasn't really picked up, but I think because people didn't really understand passing and the complicated ways in which people might have engaged with passing. But people are more open about passing now. And I had Heidi on a panel and she was like, yeah, I now don't reject the idea that Belle was actively passing. I was like, yeah, Belle was actively passing. And and actually, it says it's more of an indictment on the US than it is an indictment on Belle, right? Because without her, if she had not passed, we would not have the Morgan, right? Library and Museum. We would not know of this woman's brilliance, right? She was an autodidact. She had some training here and there, but Belle would hire people, tutors and such. She learned, Spanish and French, German, and Italian to be able to kind of read and to, be able to detect, forgeries, right? That was extremely important because Morgan, who was so acquisitive, he would just buy stuff. People would just sell him all kinds of junk, right? And he just, because he wanted to be important, he would just be buying stuff up and some of it was fake. And so Belle had to develop that expertise to be able to discern when he was getting a deal and when people were inflating the price for something. And so she actually, so she did what she had to do. And again, we have a wonderful institution because she did what she had to do.
want to invite you all to say what you're thinking or what questions, reactions. I mean, this was a lot to take in.
Yeah.
So what a fascinating figure. Barbara, yeah.
I have a question. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm like chills, actually. You said a line earlier when you were describing Belle, and you said she double dutched on the color line. And I really liked that, and I found it really poignant. And thinking about, and in your talk to you mentioned that she was challenging people to call her out on her blackness. And at the same time, people were aware of it, but because of sort of the position that she sort of occupied, they couldn't necessarily outright call her out on it. As you were talking, I was thinking about an essay that Patricia Williams writes, who she writes this essay about archiving her family's information at the Harvard Archive Library or something. And she comes from a family of elite Black folk, some of whom had passed this way as well. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about this desire to enter white spaces and like to be like affirmed by white spaces, whether through passing or sort of like engaging in the archive. Like the fact that like Barrington refused to burn his, this is like, I'm thinking out loud as I'm asking the question, but there's a particular affinity for, even in this like indictment of American culture and American whiteness, a lot of Black folk tend to desire to enter that space and be remembered within that environment. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I mean, and I'm not, you know, because with Belle, I don't necessarily know if, I don't think the family would have done that had the opportunities been there on the other side of the color line, right? I think 1896, a lot of people decided, it's, you know, right? It's, we got to make this leap or else it'll be foreclosed to us. Primarily because they were so well educated, and they were in DC where there were a lot of other Black people who, you know, now of course they didn't have the money of the Morgans or the Vanderbilts, right? And Belle, of course, has some pretty scathing things to say about the Vanderbilts. You know, although she did go to summer in their cottage in Newport, and you know, be on their yachts and everything. But she did think that they were kind of half-baked, ill, you know, dim-witted, and you know, and just had a lot of money, and they would just buy stuff up, right? Kind of like the Gilded Age, that family that's shunned, and eventually has to win everybody has to, of course, bow down because they're so freaking wealthy. But I think for Belle, it wasn't that they thought that whiteness was so great, right? I think that for her, it really was, the mother saw, and Belle was old enough to see as well, that white people had things, and that they were entitled to those things. And they could see how the colored elite, that was as elite as they could be. They were not, there were very few, Robert Churches, right? Who's Mary Church Terrell's father, who was, a millionaire, right? Madam C.J. Walker's and whatnot. And of course, that was, she was, 20th century. So Belle is, late 19th century. But the mother certainly could see around her what the standards were, what was going to happen. And she was seeing what was happening to her husband, right? Who was Harvard educated. This was clearly, if you want to read about, Black genius just simply being ground down, this is what happened to Richard Greener. There was just no reason why he should not have been, he should not have been able to soar, despite the fact that he was a kind of jacked up person, personally. But there was just no reason that he shouldn't have been able to kind of soar in an America that, where he could have had all these opportunities. You go to Harvard, you're given this opportunity in Reconstruction America, and then everything is just dashed. Right? And then you're struggling at every turn to try and make a come up. Right? And, the mother sees this as like, this is the way it's going to be. And I don't want any of this. Right? So I'd imagine it was a very hard decision to make for them to decide to, but the good thing is they did it together. Right? So in many respects, unlike a lot of people who pass and it's just them and and they're by themselves, and they had one another. So in their private spaces, I can imagine again that they have this black woman who Belle writes about at some point, losing her mammy, and she was and she writes about her in terms that are actually kind of very denigrating, and almost as if she's a slave and whatnot, very exaggerated. With Belle, you just don't know, because she liked to, she could be catty, she wrote on anything, right? It didn't matter. She just writes something off. But she could be funny and irreverent and all of that stuff there. And she exaggerated, right? And so she knew white people very well. So she knew what to say, right? And again, in her efforts to distance herself from that blackness, she's writing in this very interesting way. So yes, there were those who passed who definitely wanted to simply, I was thinking about this book. It's called The Sweeter the Juice, where she writes, you have this black family who, of course, through, again, circumstances not of their own making, end up in, and they have to make a choice. One family, one of them decides to go to the white side, the sisters. One goes white, one stays black. The black family, of course, does incredibly well, right? Despite the odds. They become doctors, lawyers, and it's the black, daughter, the descendant who's writing this book about the family. They find the white sister out in California living in a trailer park, powdered her face, but she's just as happy as she can be because she's white, right? And so there is a possessive investment in whiteness, as George Lipsitz would talk about, right? And that for her, it did not matter that her black side of the family that she had left had gone on and done wonderful things, and she was living in this trailer park, right, with powdered face, like Belle, right? She was white, right? And the family members who were visiting her, her relatives, the, sons and daughters, they were white. And so, Roediger talks about, right, the wages of whiteness, right? And the ways in which whiteness itself pays a certain wage. And so there were those who did that, but I don't think that was particularly Belle's investment. She had, for too long, 17 years, had been steeped in blackness, right? If she was younger, maybe. But she was pretty much grown, right? She was going to school and she could see the differences and wanted that. She was ambitious, clearly in 1909, but she's a 30-year-old woman. She's seen a lot, right? And so she wanted that, felt she deserved it, felt her family deserved it, and her father has certainly struggled for it. There is some idea that maybe she went to see her father in Chicago, because he ends up in Chicago. He gets an appointment in like Russia, Siberia, or whatever, and then essentially has a huge falling out and is kind of kicked out of the services. He's in the Foreign Service, and messes that up, and has a Japanese wife, has whatever, and ends up back in Chicago, and Belle goes to Chicago for some reason, and no one knows why, except we don't know that Richard Greener was there. And so it's possible that she probably interacted with her father. Now, again, the Morgan will be doing this exhibit in 2024. And so they will be bringing together artists and, writers. And so there's about 7 of us, on the advisory. And part of this essay, in which I write about Church, and because I write before she becomes Church Terrell, but Church, as well as Meta Warrick, the sculptor, and Belle, I write about these 19th century women who end up abroad, right? And their experiences and why. And really, I kind of argue it's around Americanness, that at certain points, even Mary Church Terrell says, look, I am not going around hollering, I am Black at the top of my lungs, because I'm just who I am. I don't have to do that. But whenever she would encounter Americans, again, that's when she would be, outed, and, or something would happen. And she was not deliberately passing. She was just trying to be, right? And so I think, and that particular essay will be coming out. The National Portrait Gallery is doing an exhibit called Brilliant Exiles. And that will be in the fall. And so it is on American women in Paris. And so in that, I write about those 3 and their time in Paris. So
Thank you so much.
a long answer, but
Thank you.
You answered one of my other questions, so I don't have to ask 3. So.
Okay.
Did she have a romantic relationship with J.P. Morgan?
I absolutely believe they did. There were way too many nights spent alone. There she would be late. They're late, and yeah, I would definitely. And his rages, whenever she would, try and go to Europe, and he was, he did not. He was very clear, emphatic that he did not want her seeing Berenson. It was just the possessiveness was a bit too much. Now, of course, he was a, inveterate womanizer himself, and Belle would often have to run interference between he and his various paramours, and so when she does say "we tried," and people think that's just Belle being flip, I think Belle was being more than flip. There was just too many nights alone.
And I got two other questions. Back to Berenson. Berenson wrote his wife about Belle, right?
Oh yeah, they were very open. I mean, Mary was very, he would write about his mistresses to Mary, and so Mary was, and she would give him advice, and because she herself had affairs. They had an understanding. She had affairs too, but I think Belle really threw her for a loop because he was so taken with Belle, and he was so miserable. When Belle wouldn't write and whatever, and she would try and cheer him up, and he would, and say, well, she will write, and it'll be okay, and blah blah blah, and and of course she would write her other friends like, this Belle is just like, essentially cutting the fool and got him over here in the corner crying, and so I think he was very. He was quite taken with her, and it was a little frustrating for Mary because he had had lots of other lovers, but this was very different. And once he and Belle petered out, and she visited, he had taken a younger lover. Belle herself was like, well, I guess I have to, settle for whatever. But by this time she had, she was over it, whatever. But he would be miserable because word would get back that she was flirting with, this one or that one, and whatever. And, Belle did have some female companions. And so there is some, wondering if if Belle was, actually, a lesbian, and, and she would, towards the, the end of her life when she was, or the second, I would say her second act, after Berenson, that perhaps, she had a female traveling companion. And there could have been something there, but we do know for a fact that, there was something there with Berenson. But yeah, Mary was very much involved. And I don't necessarily think, I think Belle thought he was safe because he was already married. She didn't have to worry about him trying to propose marriage and whatnot and get too silly. Right, with it. So I think that's what he was very, very safe in that way. But, she had all sorts of marriage proposals that she, kind of said no to.
And this last question. Now, her as a collective, we see the genius, but she's also kind of got this free spirit. So would she actually spit on a painting to see if it was fake?
Now I haven't heard. I don't believe she did that.
Okay.
No. She definitely was using her skills to kind of, determine, the authenticity of a painting. She would, look, they did all sorts of things to determine if something was fake back then, but spitting was not one of the things that I had read about that Belle had done. Now, it might be buried in some archive somewhere that Belle did spit on something, but yeah, she was, she had really, she had studied. And and in this way, Berenson was actually quite instrumental in kind of, in some respects, educating Belle about certain things, because he was a leading art critic, but he was also stunned at how much she knew, right? And particularly, she was unmatched when it came to Incunabula and rare manuscripts. And she was a fast, learner. So he couldn't, in the same way, it wasn't like he had this young woman who he was molding in a certain way. Belle was too much of a free spirit. But she did learn a lot from Berenson, and he taught her a lot too.
Thank you.
Jasmine then.
This is riveting. I'm like, can this make it to TV? You paint a picture of one, like, Black high society for whom passing is like going on the wrong side of the tracks. Like, why are you over there with those people? And I just love how you treat passing here, because it seems in this story, Morgan is the scandalous one, not Belle. And when I think about what his peers are doing at the time, I'm thinking of Getty and all these other people. It seems like, aside from the possible love interest, he tolerates her because she's cleaning him up with her knowledge and her skill, and she's irreplaceable. So can you say more about that? Because I'm just really taken by this idea of like what passing does for people who are presumably already white. Because she's interacting with all of these Black people, and she's not worried about being outed through proximity to her Black maid. It sounds like she's writing letters with a mind for archiving herself or creating a story through how she talks about herself. And it seems like Morgan just needs her. She's kind of watching his money and making his legacy for him at the same time. So it's just a fascinating way to think about, what passing does for people other than the presumably Black people who pass.
Exactly, right? Again, Morgan, I mean, that's the thing, right? There's always the kind of focus on what the passer gets, right? And in this particular case, it's clear that Morgan greatly benefits from this brilliant Black woman, right? From her expertise and her doggedness, right? She would stay after, for hours in the library, right? There were times when she was supposed to travel, and she couldn't because they were building, the new wing to the library and museum. She had to make sure that it was done just so. Now, Morgan was already dead, but the point is that was her dedication to being a great librarian and building this wonderful library and museum. So actually the benefit is accrued more so to the Morgan legacy, as well as to New York City itself as this place of, a cosmopolitan, space that she's helped create it. And also as scholars, right? I mean, she kind of changed the game, right? Like opened it up so that so many others, presumably not a lot of us, could have gone, right there, but certainly opened that space up, and the concept of that you would have the lending library, that you would share this art with the world, that you would share these books, and so people could flourish, right? So absolutely, there was more gained, and she lived comfortably for sure. But let's imagine, had she not, and like Morgan was a bit of a rogue, right? And I think when they discovered, at the end of his life, like, oh, he was actually kind of broke. He wasn't as rich as they thought he was. I mean, he was broke compared to the Vanderbilts, right? By this time, right? Because he had bought so much, right? And so they were like, whoa, he wasn't, the money wasn't his whatever. But he left again this magnificent institution with this woman's help. And so absolutely more has accrued to us as Americans than certainly, and there were costs, I'm sure, to be borne, right? Because even when they all passed over, right, there was still the grandmother, the whatever, but I'm sure Genevieve might have we don't know what Genevieve did, but I'm sure she might have gone back to DC occasionally to see her family and, done whatever, because they too were light enough to pass, although they were clearly living on the other side of the color line. But that's the thing about Belle, that she so carefully curated her life that the only real insights we have are those exchanges she had with librarians who worked at the Morgan, and she was very much an advocate for librarians. She thought they were underpaid, and that they needed to be paid more. And so she, wrote publicly about that, although she did not consider herself a feminist. And she gave up so much, right, to support her family, but also to support, that entity that is the Morgan, right? She wanted to leave. A friend wrote and said, listen, I'll give you some money. You can go to Europe. I know that's where you want to be. And she's like, listen, I'll make a deal with you. In 5 years, I'm going to leave this place and I'm going to go to Europe. And she wanted to leave the United States because she felt freer there, right? She wanted to live the life as a scholar. She wanted to be able to, go to the old, in the same way that others, wanted to go and enjoy Europe. She wanted to do that, but the Morgan was her priority. And so, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for this. I agree with Jasmine. I need the movie, I need the Netflix series, I need the documentary about the series. Like this is so spellbinding. I guess I have maybe a comment and a question. And my comment is just me kind of processing for myself, but it sounds like some of the most productive and kind of interesting possibilities of passing as, among other things, an indictment of the racial structure in the US, is specifically in the moments of failure, right? Like where passing is like only partially working, the moments of suspicion, all of that. And so that's something that I'm taking away with me. But in listening to you, I couldn't help but think about women like Josephine Baker and Brick Talk, less on the question of passing, but more on the question of power and privilege. Right? So Baker and Brick Talk as women who also kind of attain heights of privilege and to some degree power, but who also remain kind of at the mercy of this tacit recognition. Mm-hmm. In Baker and Brick Talk's case of their Americanness, in Greene's case of her supposed whiteness. And I guess I'm wondering if you could kind of talk to us a little bit about this interplay of vulnerability and power / privilege in Belle's life. How kind of does she navigate? Does she articulate some understanding of kind of being not so much at the mercy, but being beholden to Morgan's wealth and power? Just kind of how does she think about that interplay?
Well, she does complain. So, I mean, she would rage to Berenson about, how Morgan was controlling her life and how she, she was really clear, especially when they would have these huge fights, right? And she would, and he would deny, her ability to go to Europe, right? Or he would be raging about Berenson. And so, she definitely wrote about the sacrifices, and it would be years before she was able to get back, over to Europe. The war did intervene. It's, the Great War, right, intervened in her initial plans, but she didn't get back until like 1925. And so Morgan was long gone, but, while he was alive, it was, difficult for her to get away. So she definitely sacrificed a lot in this position, with respect to this powerful man. And so, the past, I think, had she been an efficient white woman, he would have probably done the same thing, right? If she actually did embody a white womanness, and he was, involved with her in the same way, right? This is the way in which patriarchy and wealth kind of come together, with this vulnerable woman, who also is supporting her family, right? And so she knows, so it's not just Morgan, she's sacrificing things also for her family, right? Who she does complain about as well. Right, that she wants to get away from it all, right? That's why she wants to go to Europe. They are essentially so dependent on her, and she can't stop working. She has to stay at the Morgan because they need her, and so because the mother lived with her. The others had gone off to, do their own lives, but they still, at the time when she first started, she was paying for different ones going to school, and doing things like that. So Belle was the primary, breadwinner. So it's about family, it's also about her dedication to the Morgan. So she's putting up with, certain sexist behavior that renders her all, vulnerable and less powerful, but simultaneously powerful when she's entering into these spaces and she's got to bid on, a particular set of books, right? Or, whatever, because Morgan after a while would just send her, right? So that actually says a lot about his trust. This black woman is taking millions of this white man's money, going over there saying, this is what we need to buy. And people would be quaking, right? Like, okay, here they come. How is she going to, what's going to happen? She would be negotiating, and using various intermediaries in fascinating ways, trying to escape taxes on imports, right? So she was party to that as well, right? Because there were taxes on these, things that, would come through. So it was all sorts of intrigue that she was involved with as well. So so on the one hand, powerful, but still vulnerable because she's a woman who feels responsible for her family. So, passing or no, I think any woman would have found herself in that position, but she was even more vulnerable because she knew that she was passing. And again, maybe Morgan never said a word to her, and I suspect he didn't, because she never hinted that he did, but he probably knew. And he never seemed to push those levers. It was all around a kind of dynamic of jealousy and male-female kind of dynamic. Baker and Bricktop are interesting, right? Because, they rise to these heights in Paris, are able to do things that others aren't, buy property, et cetera, et cetera. And embrace blackness, right? Even though, Baker attempted to craft a narrative of herself that was whatever. But she still was considered black, right? In the context, they needed her to be black in France, right? What I find interesting about the Baker and Bricktop thing, as they kind of embrace the blackness, is Belle was very clear. A friend of hers had talked about her coming to Europe, and she was like, and to Paris in particular, and she's like, yeah, I can imagine. I would have bells on my breasts and on my toes. She knew that they would reduce her to an exotic curio. So this was pre-Baker when she's writing this. There was just no way. Now she ends up in Paris in 1925 as Bricktop is switching to Bricktop's club, right? So Bricktop is at, she's off, I guess, during the summer, whatever, she comes back. But by this time, she's been discovered by Fanny Ward, and Fanny Ward is upset with, Florence Jones, who's at another club, who she feels has become too uppity, right? Because Florence Jones wouldn't go to the tables, of people unless they were giving her lots of money and buying champagne, right? Raising money for the club. And so they were like, oh, she's just become too uppity. And so she kind of directed, Americans to Bricktop. And then eventually Bricktop moves into her own club and she directed Americans there as well. Now, what's the connection here is we know that probably more than likely, I would say, Belle probably went to Bricktop's because Belle she was a bon vivant. She loved to go to the clubs. She liked to drink. She liked to smoke. She was a modern woman in every sense of the word. Had lovers, dalliances and flirtations, and, she was no prim, whatever. But Fanny Ward and Belle were friends, right? And in one of the letters, she gives Fanny Ward $400 to pay her rent. And I was like, huh? When I read that, I was like, what? This is very interesting. Because after Fanny Ward's first divorce, her first husband, she had lost all of her money. And so she needed money. And so Belle gave her money. And so Fanny Ward was in Paris. She would have told Belle, go to Bricktop's, right? These are the places, because sometimes, Belle would get out and socialize and do whatever. She would have told her, and 1925 would have been key at the time when we have the Montparnasse and Montmartre kind of, at its height. When all of these people are arriving. Belle would have been swept up into that. Again, even if she's not writing about it, we can't really find her writing about it, but there's just no way, I don't believe that Fanny Ward, who had decided to live in Europe for, would have not told her about that and given that connection. So yeah, it's interesting that, so she's very clear. She knows what the stakes are very early on. It's like, nah, I know. Living there, this is what's going to happen in Paris, right? She's not going to probably be taken as seriously as Natalie Barney, right? Who starts a salon and who's got money, et cetera, if she goes as a black woman. So for her, she's going to go to Europe as a white woman. Right, so at least she has a modicum. She's built all of this respect around who she was, right? You should, like, some of the letters, people are assuming that the director at the Morgan Library is a man, right? And they're saying, "Dear sir, can you da 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 da?" And so once she's in Europe and people have to kind of interface with her, and I mean, she was working with popes, to get things translated, sending out rare books to make sure things, So I mean, very, very, very well connected, right? You've got the American Library in Paris asking for things. Pierre Loti wants to, talk with her and meet with her about things, right? So, I mean, extremely well. The French university presses, are writing, asking for permission to do X, Y, and Z. So Belle is very, very well connected. So she's going to go to Europe. She's going to go, as Belle da Costa Greene, the white woman, because she sees what's happened to black women like Baker, right?
So moving, so many different directions. One question, thinking her expertise and your expression of her living on data. Psychologically, I can't imagine, and I wonder what you think about her perfecting, detecting a false incunabula that could pass for X thousands of dollars. The psychological connection, what do you make of that? How did you see her pulling that off brilliantly at the highest level?
It's fascinating that you make, that's a fascinating point that, here she is spotting fakes, right? When she herself is passing, right? And so it's kind of like, wow, this is interesting. That is it's kind of like she's saying, this isn't real, right? And neither am I. No, yeah, I mean, I think, the way in which they write about her, she was extremely, very well, again, Belle was sharp-tongued, very sharp-witted, smart, and could certainly, people talked about when she walked in the room, they would quake because they didn't know what was going to happen. Right. And, and when they brought her things, right, like when that person who wrote so terribly, about her, right. He's had more to say about her biting her nails to the quick and her being kind of bloated, probably from drinking too much, blah, 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 said, other things in that letter. But at the same time, so, in fear that she's going to look at these novels, right, and denounce them in some ways. And so is so delighted when he can walk away and tell, as the book agent, tell his collector that Belle Greene has said that these are great, your collecting is fine, your blah, 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 blah. So that kind of power, and she knew. She was imperious, she was a perfectionist. When Marcel Duchamp came from France and he wanted a job at the library, she tried him out, fired him, and so she was like, just told him you're not working out, because she was extremely exacting. She was not playing about the Morgan. And of course, what did he do? One of his ready-mades, he published, he had it done, I think it was called, I can't remember the name that he used, but it was kind of like, C'est la vie rosée was one of the ones. And he created a ready-made, a perfume bottle, of him dressed as a woman. And Man Ray took the picture on this ready-made, and it was called, I'll have to think of it, I have it written somewhere. But nonetheless, it was about, so he's passing as a woman on this bottle. And the original, like when people see it now, it's a peach, whatever, but the original was green. And it was a play on Belle's name, right? As, that particular, the part of that kind of surrealist, new way, the art, movements, were, so it was a kind of play on those things. And so it was really, it was a poke at Belle, right? So that he's passing as a woman and Belle herself is passing as white, and the green eyes, and the liquid in the bottle was also green. So that was his way of kind of getting revenge after Belle had fired him. And so he was a kind of big deal in the art world, even when he came over, but, he didn't have much to offer the libraries. So that was, so she did not, if you were not serious, if you were not, she was very well aware of her power and very well, when she, for a posthumous book that was put together for her. It was a beautiful book of just different kind of art movements and pictures in there. The respect she garnered was amazing, and unthinkable had they known. It would have just all blown up, right? I think that she began to kind of, who knows, she probably laughed about some of the things she probably heard or whatever. I don't know. She was fearless, though. And I think part of it is she had gotten so high up and had so much, nothing could really touch her. As I told the story of her nephew who, was the one young woman came to ask, were they really black? And Belle said, yeah. And she wrote him a horrible letter and he killed himself. And so Belle would come, she would admit, when directly confronted on this question. And so they were circulating, but never to Belle herself. I think this is the first time that someone actually directly confronted her about, and her nephew was and he was in the military. And there was no open combat or anything that was going on. So, yeah, it's pretty tragic, again, these issues around race and whatever. And so she knew, so if you know that, she knew the cost. right? And so that was one of the reasons. But again, she just dared. She just dared.
I mean, I think her fearlessness is just really interesting to me, because a lot of the literature that you read on passing.
It's always about fear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Pure, motivated by fear.
Yeah.
And she is at these moments extremely, very conscious about hiding and passing, and then not.
Mm-hmm. But money will do that for you,
money
right?
will do that.
Yeah. Right.
And I think she was aware of that. I was just thinking about when you were talking about like how people were aware of her Black ancestry, but they wouldn't directly confront her with it. That complicity from whites, and I was just thinking about. I was wondering like how were Black people also reading her and kind of dealing with her, because there was seems like there was complicity on both ends from white people, and also there was a buy-in from the Black community that she came from, this elite Black community in DC that she came from. You talk about like the complicity on both ends, because they both didn't out her, and they could have, and she could have been also useful. I'm thinking about like what's going on in the country, sort of politically. She could have been useful to Black people at that, and she wasn't. Yeah. But they allowed her to kind of stay in those spaces.
Yeah, I think for Belle, I think for Black folk, I think many of them, like Mary Church Terrell said, they simply wouldn't. They understood why they crossed the color line. They were more than qualified for the jobs that they were occupying in the spaces that they were in, and so there, for her, it was still it was a good thing for the race, right? No matter, even if they weren't out. Right. And so there was no reason to out them because they completely understood. Right. I think as we got older, I think as things kind of moved forward in time, one looks back. I think now we're not at that place, but I think at a certain moment in time, looking back, one would have thought that Belle was a race traitor and all sorts of things. There would not have been that same sort of complicity. But when you're living in the kind of crucible of racism, the kind of, violent, life draining and certainly life threatening racism, they understood why Belle would have made the choices that she made. And they also probably had a great deal of respect for her father. And what she was doing, they could see that higher purpose, even if they weren't directly benefiting in the way in which they had others who were doing that, Du Bois and whatever. There was no need for Belle to kind of step out there. And of course, even at that point, there were not many Black women they would have allowed that space to step out there, right? So I think that was kind of part of the compromise, the complicity on the part, or the compromise or complicity, right? And of course, they were in on the joke. Right. And so there was always that kind of delight as well. But I think on the other side with white folks, there was a kind of white politesse operating, right? That you did not, so you were not going to question it, even if you knew that there was something, as the person said, she was noticeably Negro. But you better not say nothing, right? You can write all you want, talk about her like a dog, right? In these letters, right? Call her half-breed and a liar and everything else. But you better not, you would not say that to her face because she was so powerful. So she had the Morgan's millions, but she was also brilliant and, and spirited and, and would probably openly challenge them. So, and no one wanted to get on the wrong side of, the Morgans or Belle. If you're in that world, that book and art collecting world, right? Why would anyone from the Met think about it when Belle is making it possible post, Morgan's death for them to continue to have this art? Right? So what do? You put her on the board. You make her a lifetime member because you still want to get that art. Right? So, and an interesting fun fact is like she's the first woman to be accepted in the medieval society. Her father, of course, had some connection as well. So, again, so Belle is, so Morgan is one force to be reckoned with, but she herself is a force to be reckoned with, right? Her intellect. So she, of course, she has fully become Belle da Costa Greene, eminent librarian with access to X, Y, and Z, and a very powerful woman with this very powerful this Morgan money behind her. And so white politesse is not in her circle, is not going to allow her and it's not like she was traveling south. She wasn't doing Mary Church Terrell things like, going, deep south trying to rally away. She was apolitical. She was very clear when women would ask her to speak as a woman. She was like, no, I'm not speaking as a woman. I'll speak as a librarian, and blah, 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 blah. When the whole idea of the vote and all that stuff came about, women were agitating, for the vote, and, the whole suffragette movement. Belle was not with that. She was very clear, I don't understand this business of whatever, right? And part of that may have been her own kind of understanding that she was in a space that was predominantly occupied by men, and she didn't need to kind of rock the boat even more by rah-ing that. She was already dominating, that playing field. There was no need to she was getting what she wanted. So it was, very interesting the way she navigated certain things. She's a very complex woman. Yeah.
Again, thank you so much for this gem.